I believed in fairies as a kid. More than believed in them. I think something terrible happened to me, and I've just buried it until now. Call me a typical emotion bottling man, but I have never considered therapy. No matter what I went through, no matter how many times I thought to myself, verbatim, that I should talk to someone about this, I just never thought of it as an option. It simply wasn't on my roster. It was just one of those things that existed on a separate plane of existence than I was living in, never to cross paths or interact lest the universe collapse in on itself. I have no problem with therapy, don't get me wrong. It isn't like I don't understand the overall appeal. I have plenty of friends who swear by it, swear it has helped them tremendously, including my wife. It just wasn't ever something I thought was in my cards. I just never really thought about it, I told Alice one evening, when she had brought the topic up once again after dinner. There was a serene sense of peace wafting through the entire house that day, and I was feeling content. It was a Sunday, and swimming season, so we had dropped Emmy off that morning at the public pool for practice and gone straight to our favorite breakfast place. The rest of the day was filled with all the conversation that had built up over the week, all the topics we couldn't fully dig into with each other while babysitting our 8-year-old, and lounging, all crammed in between sporadic bursts of housework and paperwork we had to catch up on. It was the perfect day, in my humble opinion. It was a lovely moment of peace in the midst of a chaotic life, as is life with kids. And now the sounds of Mario Kart drifted in from the living room, Emmy's squeals cutting through the cheery music every now and then, causing Alice and I to share small smiles of acknowledgement. Oh, to be a child again. Still a little drenched from a post-swimming shower, full of chili, eyes glowing with the reflection of a television screen. Well, maybe you should. My wife was scooping leftover chili into a Tupperware with a ladle. Her hair had been tied up like it was every day after dinner, as if she planned to run a marathon rather than do the cleaning up. She wasn't looking at me, dialed into the task at hand. It's crazy how some parts of my memory could be so good, and others non-existent. I reached over from where I stood before the dishwasher, sliding my arm around her waist. She gave me a look, like, what? I just don't think it's for me, babe, I muttered, resting my mouth on her shoulder as if I was trying to skip her ears and speak right through her skin. You know those things make me uncomfortable sometimes. She let out a half-groan, half-sigh, setting down the container and the ladle and turning to face me, draping her arms over my shoulders. Everything makes you uncomfortable, John. I smiled, letting my hands fall to her hips. I knew her frustrated act was just that, an act, at least for the most part. It's good for you, she continued pointedly, reaching up to tap her pointer finger against my forehead as I swayed her back and forth to a non-existent tune. Like medicine. And I know for a fact there are some things you need to work through. I feigned offense. You think I'm some kind of nut job. Everyone needs therapy, she snarled, pulling out of my arms, but she didn't resist when I reached out and drew her back in. Not just nut jobs, and that was how most of those conversations went. Some got a little more heated, ending with a lightly slammed door, so as not to wake our daughter, and a whisper shout of, *, this is why you need therapy. I feel I'm making it sound bad, but it wasn't. Even our more serious fights never quite felt like fights. They felt like playing. We were like two cats, biting and tackling and swishing our tails, but never baring our teeth to hiss. I never felt genuine, full-bodied anger towards her, and I knew she felt the same. It sounds sappy, but we were just very in love. I sometimes felt that we had never actually left the honeymoon phase. I'm also making it sound like that conversation was incredibly common, and it wasn't. It came up maybe once every few months. I knew she was just looking out for me. She knew me better than anyone. We had met through mutual friends, and we had initially bonded over our terrible childhoods. We both had moms who were out of the picture, and over-emotional, overcompensating dads, although this manifested in vastly different ways. Alice's mother left her father for a D-list rock star type, following him on his statewide tour. She would sometimes send Alice letters or postcards from the road, although her dad wouldn't always let her keep them if they seemed to be stained with blood or seemed to have made contact with any strange white powders. Her dad coped with anger. He never laid a hand on her. but his shouting and the sounds of glass bottles smashing against the walls kept her up almost every night. During the days he'd take her out, buy her things, go mini golfing and bowling and to the movies. Anything to seem more fun than her mother. My mother passed away on my 7th birthday. She was driving home from work, which was at a law firm half an hour away from our house, when it began to rain. She was texting my dad her ETA when she ran a red light and a semi-truck T-boned her, completely obliterating her car. After that, everything changed. My 7th birthday could have been my 21st. At night it was the worst. I remember sitting with my dad as he cried, curled up in a sobbing ball on the filthy living room carpet, whimpering like a kicked puppy. He would scream and wail so loud the walls shook. He would say, over and over as if I wasn't hearing him, sometimes mumbling and sometimes shrieking, "She was cut in half. I'm sorry, sir, she's gone. No, there's no chance she survived, she was completely cut in half." The days were almost worse. During the day, when he could decrease the helpless wails into weeping at the very least, his attention turned to me. He tried to get something out of me, almost silently begging me to break down with him. Every other second it was, "How are you feeling, son? Do you understand what's happening? You poor thing, you must be devastated, your mommy is gone. Don't you want to cry?" But I couldn't indulge, and I didn't want to. I had to wash the sheets, because he'd pissed them again, and I didn't want him to sleep in it and smell like pee when he took me to school the next day. I had to vacuum the carpet, so the next time he curled up on it and wanted he dies too, when he finally stood up, his cheek wouldn't be caked in crumbs and dust. I don't know if I ever truly mourned. My mother's death was more like an absence, as if someone had taken a pair of scissors and carved a chunk out of my side, or snipped off a limb. I could still feel her, I could still talk to her, but all I got back was a deep ache and a crushing silence. I hated how people reacted when I told them my mom was dead, and had been since I was a little boy. I hated the looks on their faces when they asked how she died, and when I told them. How their mouths fell open dumbly and their eyebrows twisted and contorted in sympathetic horror. "I'm so sorry, I didn't know," they said, as if there was vomit rising in their throats, and I wanted to say, "Well, you asked, didn't you?" Alice never reacted like that. In fact, she never really even asked me what happened. We were on our second date, nursing beers while leaning against the pool table at a dingy speakeasy, when she told me about her own mom. It was the first time in a long time I actually felt like the conversation was open, like I could respond and she would listen and care, but not too much. Not an uncomfortable amount. When I told her about my parents she didn't say anything, and her pretty face didn't contort. She leaned over the corner of the pool table and kissed me on the cheek, took my hand. The day she found out she was pregnant, we promised each other to be better, to not let our child ever have to grieve alone or feel the very specific hopeless terror that only a parent can cause. So maybe I should have listened to her. Maybe I should have gone to therapy the first time she brought it up, the first time she told me how it had helped her get through her own terrible memories. But if I'm being honest, I didn't think I had anything to get through. I had left it in the past. I had coped so far in my own somewhat crooked way, I didn't want to dig any of that back up. I didn't want to be put back in that place where I was expected to talk, to cry, to open up. It made my skin crawl just thinking about it. I was always the therapist, I would say to her with a crooked grin. And I like it that way. Then, the dreams started. I could tell you I don't know what triggered them, I don't know why it was now. But that wouldn't be the truth. I know exactly why I started to remember. At first, they were brief. Nightmares that I couldn't quite recall or explain, waking up disoriented and a little sick. The rest of my day would feel strange, like I was surrounded by a thick fog. Eventually, they started to wake me up in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat and screaming, scaring the shit out of my wife. Once I ran to the bathroom and threw up, barely making it to the toilet. That was when the word, therapy, came up again. It feels like I've been in a coma for 20 years, and I'm just waking up now. It's so strange how different the world looks to a child. I believed in fairies as a kid. Laugh it up if you want. When I turned 4, my aunt brought me this book. We've all had one, I think. It was one of those huge hardcover books filled with information about something mythical, with little patches of fabric to simulate a mermaid's scales or a dragon's claw. Mine was about fairies, and it was so real to me. My mom would sit up with me later than she probably should have, reading to me, placing my hand on the textures to feel. I wanted to know everything about them. I became obsessed, and naturally, my parents played along. They bought me toys, books. Every year I had a Fae-themed birthday cake, and any kid who dared to giggle behind their hands weren't invited to next year's celebration. When I was old enough to use the internet, supervised of course, I began further research. My mom helped me navigate Wikipedia first, and they had plenty of information to sustain me for a while. My interest turned from wings and magical powers to different types of Fae from every corner of the earth, mushroom rings and their alleged distaste for iron. While I still wasn't very good at reading, I would just look at the pictures until she got home from work. When my mom died, the fairy memorabilia began to amp up. My aunt bought me new books, gave them to me wrapped and tied with ribbons with tear-filled eyes, and my dad brought them up whenever he thought I needed comforting and felt strong enough to leave the house. Wanna go look in the forest for fairies, son? I'm embarrassed to admit it, but I began to worship the fairies. I was convinced they lived in the forest behind my house, just behind each tree I looked at, hiding from me. I would spend my weekends escaping into the woods with a bucket and a cheap pair of binoculars, positive that this day, I would see one. At night, when my dad finally passed out in his own puddle of tears and other bodily fluids, I would pray to them. I never believed in God. We weren't a particularly religious family, and besides, I had seen what good he had done for my dad thus far. But I believed in the fairies. I asked them for help with my father. I asked them for peace. I asked them to bring her back to me. They never answered. Until they did. It was a Friday. I remember now. I'm not sure how I could have forgotten. After school I had sprinted into the shade of the trees before my dad could stop me, gripping the hem of my shirt in my fist, the thin fabric bearing the weight of 2 handfuls of the shiniest silverware and most colorful buttons I could find in our dusty cabinets. I had a plan that day. I was going to lure them to me. My path began in a clearing where I thought a ring of mushrooms may have begun to grow, but even without that, it was just the perfect spot for fairies. I could picture them flitting between the trees, chirping to each other happily, picking wildflowers to weave into flower crowns. I walked backwards all the way back to my bedroom window, dropping another item every few steps. When I got inside and looked out my window, I could see my trail of shiny things curve through the overgrown grass in our backyard and disappear into the trees. I was so excited, I could hardly contain myself. Tonight, surely, they would come to me. They would show themselves, and they would help me. But after another few late hours of coddling my father, finally convincing him to drink some water and get in bed, I was exhausted. I completely forgot about my plan. When I got to my room I collapsed on my mattress, not even bothering to undress before I closed my eyes. Then I heard it, the scratching. I opened my eyes. The moonlight shining through my bedroom window casted strange shadows across my ceiling, shadows of the swaying grass and the creaking trees. It was strangely silent, other than the sound. Usually there was lots of noise, or at the very least a few crickets, but not tonight. Tonight, I realized, I couldn't even hear the wind. I sat up slowly, as if in a dream, and looked toward my window. I couldn't see anything out there, nothing glaringly obvious at least, that could be making that noise. The scratching turned to a tap. Tap tap tap, like a fingernail against a glass. It had a playful air to it, like someone was saying, "Look over here." I stood, rubbing my eyes, and stumbled over. The tapping stopped abruptly when I got to the window and peered outside, out to the dark yard, pitch black if not for the moon's glow. The grass didn't sway, the trees didn't creak. I frowned and unlatched the window, sliding it up above my head. I was right, there was no wind. Not even a gust. Everything was still outside, like it was frozen. I actually started to believe it was frozen, that time had stopped completely somehow, before I saw it. My trail of silverware and buttons, sparkling softly in the moonlight, disappearing. It began where the path met the trees, curving off where I couldn't follow it anymore. A fork disappeared right before my eyes, right on the edge. Just vanished, as if someone who was invisible had picked it up and stuffed it in a pocket very quickly. Then another went, a spoon. Then a particularly large gold button. Whatever was taking them was doing what I had wanted. It was taking my bait, it was coming to me. And it was as if whatever had tapped at my window had wanted me to see this, wanted to show me. But something felt very, very wrong. This wasn't how I had pictured it. There was no twinkling, tiny wing thing at my window, winking at me before dashing back into the safety of the trees. There were no secrets being whispered in my ear, no fairy dust or promises of better things. Something about this wasn't right. It felt like a mimicry, almost a mockery, of what I had imagined. Like something was trying to give me what I wanted, but was rusty at it. I didn't want this anymore. My stomach twisted and my hands shook as I pulled the window back down slowly, watching more glittery things disappear from the grass, growing closer and closer. As soon as it was closed, I quickly locked it and pulled the blinds shut, turning my back to the window as if something would happen that I didn't want to see. Nothing happened. The deafening silence continued for a few seconds as my ears strained to hear anything else happening outside. Then the wind picked up, and the sounds of crickets, muffled by my closed window, filled the night air. I don't remember when I fell asleep that night, I just know I felt unnerved and jumpy for a while. I woke up the next morning feeling guilty. Had the fairies really come last night? Maybe they had come to talk to me, to bring me gifts, favors, and what had I done? I had closed my window on them. I felt ungrateful. Why had I even been scared? Because it was dark outside. What was I, a baby? When I opened my window and peered outside, I gasped. The trail of silverware and buttons was completely gone, all the way up to the last one, which I had placed on my windowsill. In its place was a shoe. I didn't know what kind of shoe it was, but it looked sort of nice, fancy. I remember smiling out the window as I opened it, as if they were looking, and taking my gift. How could I forget that night? How could I have forgotten what happened after? I feel crazy, either like I made it all up or like I've made up everything since then, like my life isn't truly my own. I remember telling my dad. I remember saying, "Dad, the fairies came last night." And the absent smile he gave me. Until I showed him their gift. The shoe. Instantly his face went pale and he snatched it from my hands, staring at me as if I was something unholy. "Where did you get this, Johnny?" "The fairies, Dad, I told you." He didn't respond, just gave me another long, solemn look, before turning away from me, still holding the present I received close to his chest. I was upset, but I knew better than throwing a tantrum. That would be too much emotion anyways, too uncomfortable. Even back then, I didn't know how to handle those things. I didn't show him their gifts after that. I didn't want to risk having them taken away. I tried not to be scared of the fairies, even though they always came at night, but I didn't go to my window when they came anymore. I read everywhere that fairies didn't particularly like to be seen, even though this one seemed to want to be. It always began with tapping, but otherwise complete silence that almost felt like it was swallowing me, and eventually the tapping would stop, the silence would pass, and I would fall asleep. In the morning there was always another gift for me, sitting on my windowsill. A sparkly gold ring, the other matching shoe, a hat. I smiled when I took every one, wanting them to know I was grateful. And I would leave things for them too, little sweets or shiny things like coins or paperclips that I found on the ground at school. Things seemed to get better with my dad for a while. He kept to himself more, he was quieter. At night he would cry softly in his room, rather than his uproarious wails that I used to have to quell so the neighbors wouldn't come knocking. During the day, he would talk to me, but more casually. He didn't ask me how I was feeling anymore, or tell me to let it out. I hoped this was the fairies. I felt invincible, like I had a secret superpower that no one knew about. I was friends with fairies. Then one night, everything changed. It started with the tapping, as always. That night I was fast asleep, catching up on well-earned rest since the nightly therapy sessions had ceased. The tapping woke me. It was that loud. It was louder than usual. but it seemed like it stopped abruptly as soon as I raised my head to look. That was different. That night, I had left my blinds up and my window open by accident. Since that first night, even though I wasn't scared anymore, I had always closed them, but this time, I must have forgotten. It was silent outside. It seemed darker than usual. I could almost make out something, a shape, way on the other side of the yard, but it was too dark and I was too far away to tell. That feeling from that first night returned. A twisting like a hand reaching into my stomach and mixing things around. A heavy feeling in my chest like someone had stolen all of the air from my room, even though the window was open. The silence seemed to crush me, bearing down on me from every angle, making my ribs hurt. The feeling that something was very wrong. I don't remember deciding to stand. Looking back, I have no idea why I would do that in my state of fight or flight. I don't know if I consciously chose to. I don't remember walking over, but I remember getting there, my hands on the windowsill and my head poking out into the completely still night air. There was something there, on the edge of the trees, right where I had seen that first fork disappear into thin air. I squinted, leaning further into the darkness to try and make out what it was. When I finally did, the outline taking shape as my eyes adjusted to the darkness, I began to shake uncontrollably. I remember that I tried to scream, but no sound would come. I couldn't move, couldn't do anything but stare. 2 legs stood in front of the trees, facing me. 2 legs, a blood-soaked pair of slacks, no shoes on the purple, swollen feet. And a jagged, violent rip in the torso where the rest of my mother's body had been severed from its lower half. It took me a while to realize that the legs weren't standing on their own. They began to move, jerking clumsily toward the window, like something I couldn't see was struggling to hold them up. I finally forced myself out of my trance and fell to my carpet, vomiting. I don't remember much else about that night yet. My dad came running when I started crying, I'm sure, but he didn't see what I saw. My mom's legs were gone, or hidden. Because they weren't for him. They were for me. We moved after that. Before now, if you had asked me why we moved so far away so suddenly, I probably would have mumbled something about the grief, and it being too hard to stay where my mother had died. But I remember why now. It was because the next morning, when I checked my windowsill, there was a hand. My mother's hand, purple and stiff, and missing her gold wedding ring. Reaching, fingers rested against the glass, like it was trying to get in. Like it had been tapping. I don't want to think about what else it might have brought, had we stayed. That thing, whatever it was, wasn't my mother, and it wasn't a fairy. I had invited something else with all my praying, with all my naive and innocent beliefs, and with all my bottled up emotions. I had invited it, and I had let it in. And then I had forgotten everything. Maybe I bottled that up, too. Now I remember. Now I'm having nightmares, and waking up with that sick feeling in my gut, my eyes jumping to our closed bedroom window. Because a week ago, my daughter woke me up very early in the morning by jumping on our bed. A week ago, she shook me awake, her eager smile stretching all the way across her face. A week ago, she told me, "Dad, the fairies came last night." She showed me a doll, a ballerina, with a pink tutu and beautiful long blonde hair. And now, with all these terrible memories hitting me like cold water to the face, only one keeps me awake at night. I asked them for help with my father. I asked them for peace. I asked them to bring her back to me. It has granted 2 of my wishes, in its own twisted way. My father grew distant from me and my mother was brought back in pieces. I'm happy now, but I don't have peace. I don't think I'll ever fully have peace, at least not with a child and a wife to try and provide for, and not with all of these memories. So what has it come back for?